So this is Bahamut, which is another sequencer patch that I devised. We're hearing the demo voice that I created for it, but I created it with the idea of producing a sequencer that could be used for all sorts of synth voices. The principle of it is, I think, pretty simple. Um, what it is, if you look across this row here, we have six LFOs. And the LFOs are summed together and then put through a quantizer. And this is a variation on something I saw in a Mylar Melodies video. I'll link that in the patch notes, probably, maybe in the description, but it's a lot to keep track of. But the idea is that each of the LFOs sort of creates an interval, right? And so sometimes those intervals add up in interesting ways, and sometimes just one of them is active. And you get this variety that is inherent to the sort of intervals. So you get consistency and variety at the same time. It's sort of a nice generative thing. It's a little bit similar to the patch I released a while back called Zaratan. But I think this approach is maybe a little bit, allows for a little bit more complexity, but also maybe a little bit more immediacy at the same time. Um, so what we have here are controls for the rate of the LFOs. So we can slow those down or speed those up, and that'll affect what we hear. Uh, and then we have duty cycle for the first four LFOs, which will affect how much of the period they spend high or low. So when they're low, the interval that they introduce is dropped out, and when they're high, the interval they introduce is present. um, For the other two LFOs, we have a shape control. And these two LFOs mix between square at 0, like the rest of the LFOs, and the fifth LFO mixes into a triangle, and the sixth LFO mixes into a ramp. And the reason for that is that it allows for movement, right? You know, you've got this sort of like static range, and you can have, especially when these LFOs are set slow with a pretty big interval change, you can have this sort of sense of rising and falling pitch. So I'm going to demonstrate that with the ramp LFO. Just set it real slow and change its shape again when it's at 1 or A10. It's in ramp shape, and in between there are these, the mixes isn't like, what you get are sort of like these weird offsets because of the way that the waveforms mix together, which are kind of neat to look at but hard to describe. But there is some use to maybe mixing between the two shapes, which is why it's a variable control rather than a push button. So we keep getting these sort of high-pitched notes as that ramp reaches its apex. We can also use the ramp because the depth controls for each of these are bipolar. We can use it to create a sense of ramping down rather than up. And the range for the sequencer is set over here. We have a maximum, which sort of sets the maximum range of each individual LFO's interval, right? So right now it's set to E2, which means that the most they can contribute, any one of them, is an octave and a fifth. But obviously when they stack on top of one another, you can get ranges that are greater than that. Then there's a minimum, which is set to A2, but since they can have negative depth, they can go below A2. This is just sort of an easy way to set some guardrails for it. And I thought about, what if I just sort of made these represent the interval changes, and I wanted something that was a little bit more playful than that. I mean, you can do that if you wanted to go in and sort of tinker with the patch. That'd be something you could change. But I really was going for something where you just kind of twist some knobs and see what happens. Rather than, thinking too much about intervals and that sort of thing. And everything goes through a quantizer. So, it makes it all kind of easy. The quantizer is located here on the second page. And if I change the key, we get some pretty quick differences in the output. Then each of the LFOs has a modifier LFO with its own rate and its own depth. So you can have the LFOs themselves be modulated, which adds some more variety into the output of the patch. And the clock also has a modifier LFO. If you want to play around with that, let's hear some of that. Okay. There's a swing control for the clock. There's also this hold chance. So what the hold chance is it's an opportunity for a gate to be held longer. And with the internal voice, if you have sustain in the envelope, you'll hear longer notes. But if there's no sustain, you'll hear rests. And I'm not going to go into the internal voice a lot. Everything's labeled there. I think it sounds pretty nice. If you just wanted to use this patch with the internal voice, I think you'd have a good time. But it can obviously be used with external gear and whatever preference of synthesizer you have. But it's a pretty simple subtractive synth built around two sawtooth and oscillators that you can detune against one another. So when I turn the sustain down, instead of long notes, what we get are rests introduced, sort of at the rate of this whole chance control. So it can work in two different ways, either to introduce some longer notes with the sustain or some rests. But this control is also bipolar. And what happens when you turn it to the negative realm is that you, instead of getting randomized holds, what you get are rhythmic holds that come in. They start being introduced every other beat, and then every third beat, and then every fourth beat, and so on, until at the extreme, it's every 16th beat. You get a longer note introduced. So I'm going to demonstrate that too. So that's just another way to add some rhythmic sort of backbone to the sequence being produced. There's one other feature, which is that you, instead of using a clock, and you can do tap tempo if nothing's coming in, it responds to MIDI clock. It also responds to CV here. And the outputs are pitch, and then gates, and then envelopes that are generated by the internal synth voices envelope. So if you want to use this with some external CV gear and you just want to save an envelope generator, you can use the envelope created here. But there's another mode. If we press this button, now the output is determined by the multiplication of the LFOs, and you can determine how many LFOs are used. The thing I'll point out is that the more LFOs used, the less often the sum or the multiplication will be high. So you'll have more gaps between the gates. We'll hear this now. It's going to be a lot slower just because of the rate of the LFOs. But again, with something sort of maybe generative in mind, if we add some attack to the envelope, let's add some reverb. So that just gives you a very different feel if you want to use that, if that's something that appeals to you. But either way, I think it's a fun patch for playing around with and sort of generating, some predictable but unpredictable melodies, let's say. And in that way, again, it's kind of like Zaratan. So that is Bahamut. I hope you enjoy it. I'm gonna do some more ambient generative things with these LFOs. Oh, there's a control to determine how many LFOs are used. So that example, I was using the first two LFOs. I'm going to add in a third LFO, which will make it even more unpredictable.